Namaskar learners. I am Bharati Sarkar and I am going to talk to you about natural environment. I think by now you know that the life is organized so beautifully, beginning from molecules to what is known as the biosphere. Now what is the biosphere? Biosphere is that part of the earth which can sustain life. Now beyond the biosphere, earth still goes on, but then there is no life beyond the biosphere. You all know that bios means life and you know that earth is round, therefore biosphere is that part. Now this biosphere has what is known as the natural environment. So what is natural environment? Natural environment is the environment which surrounds us all over the earth, and this natural environment has many what are known as biomes. Biomes are large areas which have characteristics of their own, and biomes contain large number of ecosystems. So please remember that ecosystem is a very important unit, and it's the ecosystem which is found not only on land but also in water. So it's a limited environment in which there are physical characteristics which are typical of the ecosystem, and an ecosystem also has its own characteristic fauna and flora. So let's think of an ecosystem. Pond is an ecosystem, desert is an ecosystem, forest is an ecosystem, the river is an ecosystem, the sea is an ecosystem. By now you must have understood that they are limited areas which have characteristics of their own. They have their own physical characteristics like the depth to which sunlight may penetrate, like the extent of humidity, like the temperature variation. These are all physical factors. Now apart from the physical factors which form what is known as the abiotic component of the ecosystems, this ecosystem also has a biotic component. Again I told you bios means life. So that's the living component of an ecosystem, and that consists of many communities of different kinds of organisms. For example, there are certain organisms which you find in, say, the river, which has fresh water in it, and they are very different from the kind of animals or kind of plants that you find in the sea. Now, you well understand, I deliberately took up this example to tell you that fresh water has no salt content. Therefore, the plants and the animals and all other living beings that live in the river are very different from those which live in salty water of the sea. And for this, they have specific adaptations. Let me repeat, ecosystem is a limited environment with its own specific physical features as well as its own specific biodiversity, which includes all kinds of organisms. Now the organisms, the populations of different kinds of organisms that live in an ecosystem not only interact with each other, but they also interact with the typical physical environment of the ecosystem, and that is why they are said to be very well adapted to the ecosystem. Let me tell you learners that natural ecosystems are many. I just quoted a few and you may quote many more yourself. These are all natural, but there are also ecosystems made by humans For example, you know about the agricultural fields. Now, that was not there earlier till man made the agricultural fields. When humans, started settling and agriculture began, they quickly made some fields to grow food. Similarly, there are other artificial ecosystems like the aquarium, which are human made. So, ecosystems are of two kinds, the natural ecosystems and the human made ecosystems, and therefore, we can see that there are diverse kinds of ecosystems. Now, ecosystems, let me tell you, are of tremendous use to the human beings. That is why we have to be very careful and conserve our ecosystems. For example, who gives us so much of oxygen for respiration? The trees, the plants, when they make food by photosynthesis, they give out oxygen as a product. Now, so forests give us not only oxygen, but they also act as sinks for carbon dioxide, which then cannot accumulate. You already know that accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has caused global warming and accompanied climate change. But carbon dioxide is taken up by trees. Also, you see, we get biomass as fuel from forests. We also get many kinds of very important products, not only from the forests, but also from the sea, also from the desert. And you know that Ayurveda and Unani medicine and homeopathy, how much they depend on medicines which they get from plants. So, what I mean to say is ecosystems are of great use to human beings. They also control and regulate the climate, the ecosystems, and also they are self-sustainable. Changes take place in the ecosystems, and it is always, if some degradational changes takes place, there is resilience and it becomes again active. Now, apart from that, I want to tell you that they are self-sustaining, as I just explained to you, and the objectives of going through this lesson today will be therefore study of the ecosystem, its characteristics, then study of the biogeochemical cycles which are intimately related with the ecosystems, the typical food webs and the food chains which are a characteristic feature of any ecosystem. Every ecosystem has its own food chain and food web. Then I just told you about animal adaptations, plant adaptations to the ecosystem. We will talk about that. Another topic that we will take up will be the population interactions. That means interactions between different kinds of organisms within the ecosystem. And lastly, we will talk something about population growth. We all know that there is a particular pattern in population growth. Now, let us take up the first very important feature of any ecosystem, which happens to be the food chain. Now, what is a food chain? Food chain is a chain of different kinds of organisms which have a relationship of being eaten and eating. What do I mean by this? Supposing you think of a grassland. Okay? Now, a grazing food chain, you know that grazing means eating grass, consists of grass. Who eats the grass? The deer eats the grass. Who eats the deer? The lion eats the deer. So, this is a food chain made of grass, deer and lion. You can see that there are 3 different steps in this food chain. Similarly, let us think of plants which the insects eat. Now, the insect is then eaten by the frog, and frog by, say, a vulture or a snake. Now, this has some say 4 levels. Therefore, a food chain is usually linear. It may have 3 levels, or it may have 4 levels, or it may have even up to 5, but not many more. And you will just soon understand why this is so. I just wish to tell you now about these levels. They are known as trophic levels. In biology, we understand trophos to mean feeding. So, these are feeding levels, and the first level is the level of the plant material. Now, in the land, it will be, say, the grass or the plants or the herbs. So, these are called the producers. What do? They trap solar energy and undertake photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, water from the soil, and make glucose, which turns into starch. Now, when they do this, they have actually prepared food not only for themselves, but directly or indirectly for all other organisms that live there. So, grass or plants, the green kingdom plantee forms the first trophic level, which is known as the producer. The producers produce the food, then who consumes it? First level of consumer, but second trophic level, which are the consumers. Think of the grass. Grass is eaten by the deer. So, deer or the goat, they form the consumer. Producer, then the consumer, which is of the first level consumer, then it is eaten up by the lion, which is at the second level of, or the second consumer. You may call them primary consumer, secondary consumer. Now, in this way, the energy passes through food from one trophic level to another. Now, who out of these gets the largest amount of energy? Naturally, the producer, because it traps energy from the sun, the solar energy. And supposing it traps some 10,000 joules of energy from the sun, when that energy passes on as food to the consumer, the primary consumer, already 10% of the energy would have been lost. Lost in what? Lost in the metabolism of the consumer itself, and some amount is always lost in as heat. Therefore, in a food chain, when we pass from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer to tertiary consumer, in other words, we pass from first trophic level to second to the third to the fourth, the energy is lost. By how much? By 10% at each level. Therefore, 10,000 joules at the second level becomes 1000 joules, and so on, 100 joules. So, the tertiary consumer or the last consumer really gets the least amount of energy. This 10% loss is really a fixed amount lost in nature. Now, having talked about the food chain and the energy transfer, let me also talk about the food webs. I should have also told you that not only are these food chains on soil or on grass, so grazing food chain or terrestrial food chain, there are also food chains in water, which we called aquatic food chain. For example, algae and diatoms eaten by small shrimps, shrimps eaten by prawns, prawns eaten by fish, fish eaten by larger fish, and so on and so forth, with a 10% loss of energy at every level. You will also find that there are large number of food chains occurring in an ecosystem, and they also are interconnected. How are they interconnected? For example, say the shrimp may be eaten by a larger prawn or even by a small fish. Therefore, it has two connections now. It becomes part of the food chain where it is eaten up by the fish. It is also part of the food chain which is eaten up by the prawn. And therefore, such connections of food chains is known as food web. Having told you about food chains and food web and also energy, I want to tell you that in the PowerPoint presentation that you have in your possession, you shall see pictures illustrating the different kinds of food chains, the food webs, and also presented in a different manner. For example, the energy loss is called the energy pyramid. I just told you that the energy is lost as we go up from one level to the other. So, it forms a kind of a pyramid. So, they may be shown as pyramids. Sometimes there are pyramids of number, sometimes there are pyramids of energy, sometimes there are other pyramids which show the density, etc. And therefore, the presentation may be in the form of pyramids. Now, these are all different ways in which we study ecology, which is the science of environment. Next, let us go over to what is known as the biogeochemical cycles. You know what is a cycle? A cycle is one which begins from a particular point, then goes in the form of a circle and comes back to that point. Now, these cycles, biogeochemical cycles, means those cycles found in the natural environment which have their components at some plants and animals, which also have from the geological and the geographical world or the physical world, as you may call it. For example, think of carbon. We all know what is carbon. Carbon is that element which is actually at the root of all organic chemistry. And why are we called organisms? Because our bodies are made up of organic compounds. What are organic compounds? Compounds which contain carbon. Let us think of the carbon cycle. In nature, how is carbon present? It is present as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it is taken up by plants, and it is also given out when plants and animals respire. And then what happens? This also, is in the body of plants and animals. When plants and animals die, that carbon is left on the soil, and that carbon over years becomes what is known as fossil fuels. When you burn fossil fuels, they become carbon dioxide and go into the atmosphere again. So, this is a cycle which has been very beautifully depicted in the PowerPoint presentation that you have in front of you. Kindly see that, go from point to point and make an outline biogeochemical cycle yourself. Apart from carbon, we have the water cycle, and the water cycle, you all know, again is present as water vapor in the atmosphere. Where does it come from? It comes when water from the surfaces of water bodies like the sea or the river or the pond just evaporates. It also comes into the atmosphere from the trees when they undergo what is known as transpiration, about which you have already studied. And then how does it come back to earth? It comes back when the water vapor forms clouds, and the clouds are full of water drops, and what is known as precipitation. Precipitation takes place, water falls as rain. When it falls as rains, it goes into the water bodies or even below the soil in what are known as aquifers, which are between the rocks underwater, and so on. So, what happens is that water also undergoes a cycle. Similarly, you can see that there is a nitrogen cycle, and nitrogen cycle is again nitrogen is in air, then several kinds of bacteria fix it into plants, and also it is fixed into the soil through lightning, and then different kinds of bacteria convert it into ammonia and so on and so forth. It also comes from the urines and feces of different animals and also plant decay, and again comes to the soil. So, if you take a look at the nitrogen cycle, it is absolutely clearly shown how it undergoes a cyclic change from one form to another form and remains maintained in the atmosphere. You know that plants cannot live without nitrogen because nitrogen forms the amino acids. And what do amino acids form? They form proteins, and all bodies, irrespective of whether they are plants or animals or bacteria or fungi or protocysts, they all need proteins as structural parts of their body. So, proteins are important and they are formed from amino acids which form from nitrogen. So, nitrogen is a very, very important element again. Similarly, we have oxygen, we have the phosphorus cycle, the oxygen cycle and so on, but possibly we have put only these 3 cycles so that you get a general idea of what biogeochemical cycles are all about. Now, if you remember right in the beginning, I was talking about adaptations. Let us talk about adaptations. What is an adaptation? Adaptation is the body form or the body function which helps to adjust to the physical environment or to the ecosystem in which a particular organism is living. Now, if you think of the plants, what we see all around us are what are known as the mesophytes. Now, mesophytes are the ordinary plants. You can see they have leaves which have stomata on both sides, and they have also well developed woody stem. They have roots which can go up to a certain extent to get water. If you think of those which live in the desert, we call them xerophytes. You've all seen cacti and succulents. They don't have any leaves. Why? Because their leaves have all been converted into little spines. So, that is the adaptation, leaves converted into spines. Spines will keep away and protect them from those animals which will come and attack them, and also spines are not flat leaves like others. So, there is paucity of water, there is scarcity of water. If there is scarcity of water, they have to conserve water, and therefore, there are no leaves as such like the other leaves which will give out water vapor as transpiration. Similarly, there are the hydrophytes which live in water, which do not need very long roots. So, they have shorter roots, they have spongy stem, and they have leaves which help them in floating because they do not have any soil to hold on to. So, smaller roots, and also they do not have to go very far. The roots do not need to go far to fetch water. They have smaller roots and their leaves help them in floating on the surface. So, mesophytes, xerophytes and hydrophytes. Now, what about their counterparts, the animals? We know that there are animals which can run on the ground and which their feet are modified or adapted rather. You know, all this happens through evolution. Actually, so to say, we can just mean that evolution always leads to adaptation. When evolution happens, the kind of animal or plant which comes into existence is very well adapted to the ecosystem in which it lives. Think of the camel, it lives in the desert. Now, camel, what does the camel do? It is able to have some fat stored in its hump to get energy. It does not get water for many long distances. So, it really does not need water. So, we were talking about the camel. So, it is adjusted and adapted to life in a desert. You can think of the fish which live in water, and they have aquatic adaptations like a streamlined body, fins for moving around, a well developed tail fin for balancing in water, and they have gills for respiration. Similarly, if you think of those animals which live in very cold climate where the temperature is very low, their bodies are very well adapted for insulation. So, we were talking about those which live in very cold climate, and others, there are arboreal animals which are adapted to living on trees. They have prehensile fingers. Prehensile means able to fold on themselves to catch the tree branches, and so on. So much about adaptations. Now next I will talk about population interactions. I told you that many populations form communities within the ecosystem and they interact with each other. Let us see how they cooperate with each other. Have you ever seen on the road a buffalo standing and chewing the cud with crows sitting on its back? Now crows just sit there to rest, and therefore this is a kind of a mutual cooperation between the two without much stakes involved. So this is called mutualism. Mutualism is a kind of population interaction. Then there is symbiosis, in which two different kinds of organisms will live together and or be together for some time and be of mutual help. Think of the bees. The honey bees go long distances to collect nectar. They collect nectar from the flowers and the flowers get pollinated in return. So this is of mutual benefit and it is called symbiosis. Similarly, there is commensalism. In fact, the crow and the buffalo was more a commensal than a mutual or a mutualism example. For example, you can talk of the lichens, where it's a alga and a fungus living together. The fungus is of great help to the alga in protecting it and also in collecting some minerals and water for it. So in this way, if you see the pictures, from the pictures itself you can know that organisms cooperate in nature and we have a lot to learn from them. Lastly, I will talk about population growth. Now, you know that we are now in India, how much? Little over 1.2 billion. So, what does it mean? What does a population mean? It means population is a congregation or a group of individuals which belong to the same species. We say human species all over the world are about a little over 7 billion. So many make the human population. Similarly, we may have small populations. If you see a beehive of a particular kind of honeybee, it's a small population of honeybees within that beehive. So population is really a group of individuals belonging to the same species. Now it shows two kinds of growth. Once it begins to grow in its place, in its habitat, then it will start growing, and if there is enough food and if the physical environment is congenial, it will just form a J-shaped curve, means go on increasing. Otherwise, all populations after some time reach what is known as the carrying capacity. The environment has a certain capacity to carry only a certain number of individuals, and therefore growth stops after that and you get an S-shaped curve if you just draw that curve for a particular population. Thank you. अच्छा. To summarize, we have seen what is a natural environment as part of the biosphere, what is an ecosystem and how important it is, and how do populations and communities live in an ecosystem and are interrelated through food chains and food webs. We also saw how the biogeochemical cycles go in a cycle. We also studied a little about how populations interact with each other and how plants and animals are adapted to the ecosystem. And lastly, we studied a little about the two kinds of population curves, the J-shaped when there is enough food and S-shaped when food is limited. Thank you, learners.